I lost my job on a Tuesday. By Friday, an eviction notice was taped to my door. What I didn't know was that my own parents had paid my landlord $1,000 to make it happen, and that one phone call would unravel everything they'd built. Before we get back to today's story, I have some exciting news to share. We have officially launched a brand new channel called Layer of Lies. Over there, we are dedicating our platform to bringing you the most satisfying, jaw-dropping corporate revenge stories on the internet. We're diving deep into cutthroat office politics, backstabbing bosses, toxic coworkers, and the incredible women who turned the tables and came out on top. Grab your coffee, because we are serving all the boardroom drama with full context, community reactions, and top-tier narration that brings every power move to life. Make sure to subscribe to Layer of Lies right now so you don't miss out. You'll find the link in the video description, the pinned comment, and the collaboration tag. Thank you for your continued support as we grow this community. Now, back to the story. The email wasn't meant for me. I know that now, but at 6:47 on a Thursday morning, hunched over my laptop with a mug of instant coffee going cold beside me, all I knew was that my mother's name was in my inbox at an hour when she was never awake. Susan Brown didn't do mornings. She never had. Growing up, the house stayed silent until 9, and if you made noise before then, you learned very quickly what a raised eyebrow across the breakfast table could do to your whole day. So the email felt wrong before I even opened it. A small wrongness, like a picture hung slightly crooked on a wall. You can't always name it, but your eye keeps snagging on it. The subject line read, FW, FW, Ray, the Brown Unit, Arrangement. I remember I actually laughed a little, the tired kind of laugh you do when you're too exhausted to feel anything properly. I'd been laid off 3 days earlier. Tuesday afternoon, a 15-minute video call with my manager and someone from HR I'd never met. A lot of words like restructuring and difficult decisions and your role specifically. And then a calendar invite that dissolved into gray the second the call ended, as if I'd never existed on the team at all. 4 years of work at that health tech firm, gone in the time it takes to microwave leftovers. I was a UX researcher. I studied how people behaved when they thought no one was watching. The irony of that is not lost on me. Not now, not then. So when I saw my mother's forwarded email, some part of my brain, the part that had spent 3 years as a paralegal before I ever touched a single user interview, went very still and very focused. That part of me doesn't get tired. It never has. It's the part my grandmother built. I opened it. It was a chain. You know the kind, a conversation forwarded so many times that the replies stack on top of each other like sediment, oldest at the bottom, and you have to scroll down through the geology of it to understand what actually happened. At the top was my mother forwarding it to my father, Richard, with a single line, Todd confirmed. It's done. She'll figure it out and come home like she should have 2 years ago. I didn't understand. Not yet, I scrolled. Below that was a message from an address I recognized instantly because it had been on every lease I'd signed for 2 years, T. Keller at Keller Properties. Net, Todd Keller, my landlord. The man who called me kiddo in the hallway and once fixed my garbage disposal himself and told me a long story about his fishing boat while he did it. Todd, who I had genuinely, stupidly liked. His message said, Susan, payment received, thanks. I'll post the notice this week. As we discussed, the paperwork will show non-payment even though she's current, so keep that between us. Appreciate the business. T. And below that, at the very bottom of the chain, was the message that made the cold coffee turn to acid in my stomach. My father, Richard Brown, to Todd Keller from 4 days earlier. Tuesday, the same day I lost my job. Todd, as agreed, $1,000 to expedite Olivia's removal from the unit. She's going to lose that job any day now, we've heard, and this is the fastest way to get her back where she belongs. We'll owe you one. Discretion appreciated. Richard. I read it 4 times. Then I got up, very calmly, walked to my kitchen, and I stood there holding the edge of the counter with both hands. On the shelf above the sink was a small chipped blue teacup, the only thing in the entire apartment that had ever truly belonged to me, and I looked at it for a long time. She'll figure it out and come home like she should have. The paperwork will show non-payment even though she's current. Back where she belongs. The layoff had felt like the floor giving way. I want you to understand that so you understand what came next. I had cried on Tuesday. I had sat in the dark on Wednesday. I had begun, on Thursday, to feel the first small stirrings of okay, get up, figure it out, the way you do. But this was different. The layoff was the world being indifferent. This was my family reaching into my life with two hands and pulling the ground out from under me on purpose, on the very day I was already falling. I didn't cry. That's the part people never believe when I tell it. I stood in my kitchen and I felt something in me go quiet and clear and cold, like a pond freezing over from the surface down. My parents thought they were breaking me. They had no idea they just handed me the one thing I was built to use. I didn't respond to the email. That was the first decision, and looking back, it was the most important one. Every instinct screamed at me to call my mother. To scream. To type out a reply so full of hurt that she'd have to feel it, have to understand what she'd done. My thumb actually hovered over her contact for a full minute. Susan Brown, with the photo I'd taken years ago at my cousin's graduation, back when I still believed we were the kind of family that showed up for each other. But you don't tip your hand. That's the first thing you learn in any office where documents matter more than feelings. You don't tell the other side what you know. You let them keep believing they're winning, because people who think they're winning get sloppy, and sloppy people leave a trail. So instead, I forwarded the entire email chain to 3 places. My personal Gmail, a secondary email account I'd made years ago and forgotten about, and a cloud folder I created that morning and named, without any sense of irony, Records. Then I took a screenshot of every message. Then I photographed my laptop screen with my phone, so there'd be metadata, so there'd be a timestamp, so there'd be redundancy. My grandmother's voice was in my head the whole time, the way it always is when things get hard. Keep the paper live, people lie, paper doesn't. She used to say it while doing the most ordinary things, sorting through her bills at the kitchen table, filing warranty cards for appliances she'd owned for 20 years. As a kid, I thought it was just an old woman's fussiness. It wasn't until I was older that I understood my grandmother had survived a divorce in an era when women lost everything, and she'd kept every single piece of paper that let her walk away with her house and her dignity intact. She taught me to do the same before I ever knew I'd need it. The chipped blue teacup on my shelf had been hers. When she passed, my mother had swept through her house like a tax auditor, cataloging what could be sold, what was worth something. I hadn't wanted the china or the jewelry. I'd taken the teacup, the ugly, chipped, everyday one she actually drank from, and my mother had actually rolled her eyes. "Take the junk then," she'd said. "You always did have odd priorities." I made myself a cup of tea in it that Thursday morning. My hands were steady by then. I remember being surprised by how steady. At 9:15, right on schedule, my mother finally woke up and called me. I let it ring twice before I answered, and I made my voice sound exactly the way she'd expect it to sound, small, shaky, defeated. If she wanted to hear a broken daughter, I would give her a broken daughter. It cost me nothing. "Olivia," she said, not sweetheart, not honey, just my full name, the way she said it when I disappointed her. "I heard about your job." "Your brother told me." "Jason, of course." I'd made the mistake of telling my younger brother about the layoff on Tuesday night, in a moment of weakness, needing to tell someone. And Jason, who could never keep anything from our parents, who'd been running to them with information his whole life because it was the only currency that ever bought him their approval, had passed it straight up the chain. "Yeah," I said, "it's been a rough week." Well, a pause, I could hear her stirring something, a spoon against ceramic. "This is exactly what I've been worried about. You out there all alone with no safety net. You know your room here is still made up. Your father and I think it's time you stopped playing at being independent and came home. Just until you're back on your feet, of course." Just until you're back on your feet. I turned the teacup in my hand. "That's a big decision, Mom," I said. "I'd have to figure out my lease." And there it was. The tiniest hesitation on the other end of the line, a held breath. "Oh, I wouldn't worry about the lease," she said, a little too smoothly. "Landlords are more flexible than you'd think when circumstances change." Landlords are more flexible than you'd think. She knew. Of course she knew she'd written the email. But hearing her say it, hearing her dangle the very trap she'd set as if it were a gift, as if she were offering me a soft place to land instead of the exact shove that had put me in the air, something in me hardened another degree. "I'll think about it," I said. "Don't think too long," she said. And then, warmer, almost gentle, in a way that would have melted me a week earlier. "We just want you home, Olivia. We just want to take care of you. Is that so wrong?" I said goodbye and hung up, and I sat with the phone in my lap for a long moment. Here's what I kept circling back to, all that Thursday and into the night, the phrasing. Circumstances change. Landlords are more flexible. She hadn't slipped. She'd chosen those words. My mother never said anything by accident. She was the most careful speaker I've ever known, and that meant every soft, caring word out of her mouth was a door she was holding open with one hand while she'd already nailed all the others shut. They didn't want to help me. They wanted me helpless. There is a difference, and I had spent 29 years not letting myself see it. The eviction notice showed up the next day. To understand why it hurt the way it did, you have to understand what I'd given them. I was the responsible one. That was my role from the time I was old enough to have a role at all. Jason was the golden child, 3 years younger, the one whose messes got cleaned up and whose failures got reframed as bad luck. When Jason flunked out of his first college, it was because the program wasn't the right fit. When I got a full scholarship to a state school, my father asked why I hadn't gotten into somewhere better. I paid my own way through everything. Books, rent, the paralegal certificate I earned working nights while I did it. And even then, when Jason totaled a car at 22, guess whose extra income got quietly redirected to help him out? I'd wired my parents money more times than I could count over the years, always with the understanding, never stated, always understood, that this was what good daughters did, and that my brother's needs were simply more urgent than mine because he was more fragile, more special, more theirs. I flew home for every holiday. I remembered every birthday. When my father had his knee surgery 3 years ago, I took 2 weeks of unpaid leave to sit in that house and change his dressings and drive him to physical therapy. And Jason came by once for 40 minutes, and my mother talked for a week about how thoughtful it was that he'd made the time. I want to be clear that I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you so you understand the ledger. Because there was a ledger, whether I wanted to admit it or not, and I had spent my entire adult life making deposits into an account that, it turned out, was never in my name. 2 years ago, I finally moved to a city 3 hours away for the health tech job. It was the first real distance I'd ever put between myself and them, and my mother had never forgiven me for it. "You're abandoning your family," she'd said, as though a good job and a life of my own were a personal insult to her. From that moment on, there had been a low, constant pressure to come back. Little comments, guilt trips wrapped in concern, and now, apparently, a $1,000 bribe. The bribe had a face, and his name was Todd Keller. I need to tell you about Todd, because Todd is the one who made it real. My parents lived 3 hours away. They were abstract villains, voices on a phone. But Todd was here. Todd was the charming, ruddy-faced, backslapping man who managed my building and half a dozen others, who wore golf polos and called everyone by a nickname, who had genuinely convinced me over 2 years that he was one of the good ones. He knocked on my door himself to deliver the eviction notice. That's the kind of man he was. He didn't just tape it up and slink away. He wanted to look me in the eye while he did it, wanted to perform the sad, reluctant messenger. "Hey, kiddo," he said, and I swear his face was arranged into a mask of regret so perfect it belonged in a museum. "Listen, I hate this, I really do, but the paperwork's the paperwork." He handed me the notice. Non-payment. I've got no choice, my hands are tied. I looked at the notice. Notice to quit NON payment of rent. I had a bank statement 3 feet away showing my rent had cleared on the 1st, like it always did. Todd knew that. Todd had written in an email that he knew that. And here he was, standing in my doorway, lying to my face with the easy warmth of a man who'd never once in his life been caught. That was the first tell. The lie so smooth it had no seams. The second one came 30 seconds later, and it was the one that told me everything. I played dumb. I let my eyes well up. Not hard, I was genuinely close to it anyway. And I said, "Todd, I don't understand, I'm current, I've always paid on time, please. I just lost my job. I don't have anywhere to go." And Todd, God help him, patted my shoulder and said the words that changed the entire course of what came next. "I know it's tough, but hey," and here his voice dropped into something conspiratorial and kind, like he was doing me a favor. "Your mom said you'd be a lot easier once you were back home. Family's family, right? Sometimes they know what's best. Go home, kiddo, let him take care of you." Your mom said you'd be a lot easier once you were back home. He didn't even realize what he'd done. He genuinely thought he was comforting me. He thought I already knew, thought I was in on it, or would be grateful for it, thought that a woman losing her home would just fold neatly back into her mother's plans like laundry. He had no idea he'd just placed my mother's fingerprints all over a document he'd forged, and confirmed it out loud, standing in my doorway where I could remember every word. I thanked him. I actually thanked him. I told him I understood that maybe he was right, that maybe going home was for the best. He smiled, relieved, and told me to take my time packing, no rush. He was a reasonable guy. Then I closed the door, walked to my kitchen, and picked up the chipped blue teacup. My hands weren't shaking anymore. People lie, my grandmother said, from wherever she was. Paper doesn't. And Todd Keller, it turned out, had left an awful lot of paper lying around. There's a moment in every unfair situation where you get to choose who you're going to be. Most people don't recognize it when it comes. It doesn't announce itself. It's quiet, and it usually shows up disguised as despair. Mine came that Friday night, sitting on my living room floor with the eviction notice on one side of me and my grandmother's teacup on the other, and I made my choice somewhere around midnight. I was not going to pack. I was not going home, and I was not going to spend one more day of my life being the daughter who absorbed whatever was done to her and called it love. Here's the thing my parents never understood about me, because they'd never bothered to actually know me. They thought of me as a UX researcher, some vague tech job they didn't respect and couldn't explain to their friends. What they'd conveniently forgotten was the 3 years I'd spent as a paralegal at a firm that did, among other things, landlord-tenant law. I had drafted eviction responses. I had reviewed leases for illegal clauses. I had sat in the back of housing court often enough to know exactly how these things worked, exactly what a landlord was and wasn't allowed to do, and exactly how badly Todd Keller had just broken the law. Filing a false eviction notice is not a gray area. Falsifying the reason for eviction, claiming non-payment when a tenant is current, is fraud. Accepting payment from a third party to remove a tenant outside of any legal process is a whole separate category of wrong. Todd hadn't just bent a rule. He'd driven a truck through several of them, and he documented the whole thing in an email chain that had, through some blessing of incompetence, landed in my inbox. I pulled out a legal pad. Yes, I still keep legal pads, my grandmother would have been proud, and I started building the timeline. Every date, every document. The email chain, time-stamped. The eviction notice, time-stamped. My bank statements showing rent cleared on the 1st of every month for 24 consecutive months. The lease itself, which I dug out of my records, folder, physical and digital both. Then I started a second list, and this one was labeled Todd. Because here's what my paralegal brain knew that Todd's golf polo brain hadn't considered. A man who would forge one document had almost certainly forged others. A man who'd take a cash bribe to evict a tenant had probably done shadier things than that to people with fewer resources than me. And Todd Keller managed 6 buildings. I needed help, and I knew exactly who to call. Rachel Coleman and I had started at the health tech firm the same week, 4 years ago. We'd bonded over being the only 2 people in orientation who asked follow-up questions, and we'd stayed close even after she left 2 years back to do something that actually mattered. As she put it, she'd taken a job at a tenant rights nonprofit downtown. At the time, I'd thought it was a strange pivot. Now it felt like the universe had planted a friend exactly where I'd need one. I called her Saturday morning. I told her everything, and I read her the email chain word for word, and when I finished, there was a long silence on the line. "Liv," she finally said, "I need you to understand something. What you just read me isn't a family problem. It's a case. A really, really good case." "I know," I said. "No, I don't think you do. Third-party payment to induce a fraudulent eviction. That's not just a slap on the wrist. And if this Keller guy has done it before," she exhaled. "How much do you know about the other tenants in his buildings?" "Nothing yet," I said, "but I'm about to." What followed was the strangest, most alive week of my life. By day, I was a laid-off woman with an eviction notice on her fridge. By night, I was building a case. Rachel pulled records for me through entirely legitimate channels, her nonprofit tracked eviction filings across the city, public record, all of it. And what came back made my stomach turn. Todd Keller's name, or his company's name, appeared on an unusually high number of eviction filings. Dozens over the past 3 years. And when Rachel cross-referenced them, a pattern emerged that made even her, a hardened tenant advocate, go quiet. He targeted the vulnerable. Tenants who'd fallen behind by a few weeks. Elderly renters on fixed incomes. A single mother named Denise Marsh who'd been evicted 8 months earlier on a non-payment claim that, when Rachel dug into it, didn't hold up. Denise had receipts showing she'd paid. She just hadn't known she could fight it. She'd assumed the paperwork was the paperwork, exactly like Todd wanted everyone to assume. Denise Marsh. I wrote her name on my legal pad and I underlined it twice. Because a false eviction against me, with an email chain to prove it, was a strong case. But a pattern, a documented, repeated practice of defrauding tenants, was something else entirely. That was the difference between one man getting a fine and one man being finished. I found her contact information through Rachel's organization, and I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time before I called, because I knew what I was about to do. I was about to reach into a stranger's life and reopen a wound. But I was also about to offer her something she'd probably given up on, the chance to make it right. I picked up the teacup. I made the call. Denise Marsh cried on the phone, not because she was sad, because she was relieved. "I knew it," she kept saying. "I knew I paid." Nobody would listen to me. They just said the paperwork. "The paperwork was fake," I told her. "I have proof he does this. Would you be willing to tell your story, officially?" She said yes before I even finished the question. That was the moment my private grievance became something bigger than me, and I felt the weight of it settle onto my shoulders in a way that was frightening and clarifying all at once. This wasn't just about getting back at my parents anymore. There were real people, people with fewer options than me, who'd been chewed up by the same machine. But I hadn't forgotten my parents, not for 1 second. I decided to start with them, and I decided to do it in a very specific way. Not a screaming match. Not a tearful confrontation. I wanted to reveal exactly enough to shatter their sense of control, and then watch what they did. Because what people do when they think they've been caught tells you everything about who they really are. I called my mother on Sunday evening. Family dinner time, when I knew both she and my father would be home. "Olivia." She answered, warm, expecting the broken daughter. "Have you thought more about coming home? Your father's been asking." "I have actually," I said. "But something strange happened, Mom, and I wanted to ask you about it. I got an eviction notice for non-payment." A pause, a careful, calculated pause. "Oh, sweetheart. Well, like I said, these things happen. Maybe it's a sign." "That's the thing," I said, keeping my voice light, almost puzzled. "I'm not behind on rent. I've never been behind. I have every statement. So I called my landlord to ask why the notice says non-payment, and Todd said something really interesting." I let it hang there for a second. "He said you told him I'd be easier to deal with once I came home." The silence that came back was the loudest silence I've ever heard. "I don't know what you're talking about," my mother said finally, and her voice had changed, the warmth gone, replaced with the flat, hard tone I remembered from childhood, the one that meant a door was closing. "That landlord is confused. You shouldn't listen to gossip." "Mom," I said gently, "I have the email." Another silence. Then I heard my father's voice in the background, sharp. "Who is that? Is that Olivia? What's she saying?" and my mother's muffled, urgent whisper as she covered the phone, and I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. I knew the shape of it. The panic, the scramble. When my mother came back on the line, she'd made a choice, and the choice was to attack. "You've always been like this," she snapped. "Ungrateful, dramatic. Your father and I have done nothing but try to help you, and this is how you repay us. Making up wild stories, accusing us of whatever this is. We were trying to save you, Olivia. You're throwing your life away out there alone, no husband, no family, and we tried to bring you home where you'd be safe, and you spit on it. We were trying to save you. Even now, even caught red-handed, she couldn't say the words 'I'm sorry.' She reframed the bribe as rescue, the fraud as love. She stood in the wreckage of what she'd done and told me I was the one holding the match. And here's the thing, a week earlier, that speech would have worked. It had worked my entire life. That specific combination of guilt and grievance and rewritten history was my mother's masterpiece, and I had been its audience for 29 years. But I was holding my grandmother's teacup, and I was listening to my mother lie, and I heard the whole thing the way you hear a song you finally learned the words to. Every note of manipulation, clear and named. "Okay, Mom," I said quietly. "I understand now. Thank you for being honest." She hadn't been honest, but I let her think she'd won because a person who thinks she's won stops defending herself, and I wasn't finished gathering. "So you'll come home," she said, softening instantly, victory in her voice. "I'll be in touch," I said, and hung up. I sat there shaking, not with fear, but with the strange, terrible relief of finally seeing clearly. My father hadn't even gotten on the phone. He'd let my mother do the dirty work, the way he always had, hiding behind her while pulling the strings that mattered. His name was on the email that authorized the money. He was the one who'd written back where she belongs, and he hadn't had the spine to say a single word to me directly. That was fine. The email said plenty on his behalf. They didn't take my quiet exit as a warning. They took it as a win. Over the next few days, my parents got bolder, and boldness leaves fingerprints. My mother called twice more, both times with the sunny confidence of a woman who believed her wayward daughter was finally coming to heel. She started talking logistics. Which of my things to sell, how she'd helped clear out my grandmother's house so she knew how to do it efficiently, how my old room just needed a little airing out. And she made a mistake. On the second call, trying to reassure me that everything would be taken care of, she said, "Don't even worry about the landlord. Your father handled all that. It's all been arranged. You just come home and let us take care of the rest." Your father handled all that. It's all been arranged. I was recording the call. I'll tell you plainly, I checked my state's law first, and I live in a one-party consent state, which means I was fully within my rights to record a conversation I was part of. My grandmother didn't raise me to break rules. She raised me to know them cold. So now I had it in my mother's own voice, an acknowledgement that my father had handled and arranged the situation with the landlord. It corroborated the email perfectly. Paper and voice saying the same thing. Meanwhile, Todd was making his own moves and he was getting nervous. He must have sensed something because he started calling too, first friendly, then less so. "Hey kiddo, just checking on your timeline for moving out." Then, a day later, less warm, "Olivia, I need a firm date." The units promised to someone else. Then, finally, a voicemail with an edge in it. "Look, I've been more than patient. If you're not out by the end of the month, I'll have to escalate. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Escalate? I almost laughed. Todd had no idea what escalation looked like. Because while he was leaving me threatening voicemails, Rachel and I had assembled something extraordinary. Denise Marsh had agreed to come forward. And through Denise, we'd found two more, an elderly couple named the Hoffmans, and a young man named Devin who'd been evicted 18 months ago on a non-payment claim while he had bank records proving otherwise. 4 tenants, counting me. 4 false evictions, 1 landlord, a clear pattern of fraud spanning years. Rachel had also quietly looped in a housing attorney her organization worked with, a sharp woman named Angela who reviewed everything I'd assembled and called me on a Wednesday afternoon. "Olivia," she said, "I've been doing this 15 years. This is one of the cleanest files I've ever been handed. You built this yourself." I had good training. I said, and I meant my grandmother more than the law firm. Angela laid out the path. Todd had violated tenant law on multiple counts. The pattern across 4 tenants elevated it from an individual dispute to something a housing tribunal and potentially a prosecutor would take very seriously. There would be a formal hearing. And crucially, the third-party payment, the $1,000 from my father, wasn't just evidence against Todd. It exposed my parents' role directly. "You understand what this means for your family?" Angela asked, carefully. "The email names your father. If this goes forward, his involvement becomes part of the record." I looked at the teacup on my shelf. "I understand," I said. The second confrontation, the one that finally broke Todd's confidence, happened when Angela sent him a formal letter. Not a screaming phone call. A letter on letterhead. Laying out, point by point, the fraudulent eviction, the falsified non-payment claim contradicted by my bank records, the third-party payment documented in his own emails, and the part that must have made his blood run cold, a reference to additional affected tenants prepared to provide testimony. Todd called me within an hour of receiving it. Gone was the golf polo warmth. Gone was kiddo. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice tight and high. "Do you have any idea this is a misunderstanding? We can work this out. There's no need for lawyers." "Todd," I said, "you wrote in an email that the paperwork would show non-payment even though I was current. You wrote that to my mother, who forwarded it to my father, who paid you $1,000. I paused. "There's no misunderstanding. There's just paper." The line went quiet. And in that quiet, I heard the exact sound of a man realizing that the vulnerable woman he'd tried to steamroll had, this whole time, been the most dangerous person he'd ever done business with. "See you at the hearing, Todd," I said, and I hung up. Then I made myself a cup of tea in the chipped blue cup, and for the first time in weeks, my hands were completely still. The hearing was held on a gray Thursday morning in a room that surprised me with how ordinary it was. I think part of me had expected drama, wood paneling, a raised bench, the theater of justice. Instead, it was a municipal conference room with fluorescent lights, a long table, a water cooler humming in the corner, and a hearing officer named Ms. Petrakis who had the tired, thorough eyes of someone who'd heard every excuse a human being could invent. That ordinariness, I realized, was the point. This wasn't going to be a scene. It was going to be a reckoning conducted in the flat, quiet language of facts, and there is nothing more devastating than the truth laid out plainly with no room to squirm. Todd came in a suit that didn't fit him right, flanked by a lawyer who kept checking his phone. Todd's face had lost all its ruddy warmth. He looked gray and deflated, a salesman who'd finally run out of pitch. He didn't call me kiddo, he didn't look at me at all, and my parents were there. I hadn't been sure they'd come. Angela had told me they'd received notice of the hearing because of the third-party payment. Their involvement made them relevant parties. My mother sat rigid in a chair against the wall, her chin lifted in that way she had, ready to be indignant, ready to be the wronged party. My father sat beside her, and for the first time in my life I saw him look genuinely afraid. Richard Brown, who had spent my whole childhood being certain about everything, looked like a man watching whether roll in that he couldn't stop. Jason came too, my brother. He sat a little apart from our parents, and when I walked in he wouldn't meet my eyes, and I understood that Jason knew. Maybe he'd always known. Maybe that was its own kind of grief I'd deal with later. Angela was calm and surgical. She didn't raise her voice once. She simply built it piece by piece, the way I'd built it on my legal pad all those nights ago. The lease, showing I was a tenant in good standing. My bank statements, 24 consecutive months of rent clearing on the 1st. The eviction notice claiming non-payment, directly contradicted by the statement sitting right beside it. Ms. Petrakis looked at the 2 documents, then at Todd, and made a small note. Then the email chain. Angela read it into the record in a level voice, and I watched the color leave the room. Todd's own words, "The paperwork will show non-payment even though she's current, so keep that between us." My father's words, $1,000 to expedite Olivia's removal. My mother's words, "It's done. She'll figure it out and come home like she should have." My mother made a sound then, a sharp intake of breath, and started to speak. "That's private, that's family business, she had no right." and Ms. Petrakis raised a single hand without even looking up. "Ma'am," she said, "whether it was private is not the question before me. Whether it was legal is." And then Angela brought out the others. Denise Marsh spoke first, her voice trembling at the start and steadying as she went, telling the room how she'd been thrown out of her home with her kids on a lie, how nobody would listen, how she'd believed the paperwork was the paperwork. Then Devin. Then a written statement from the Hoffmans, the elderly couple, 4 false evictions. 1 pattern. 1 landlord. Todd's lawyer stopped checking his phone. I was given a chance to speak, and I'd thought a great deal about what I'd say. I'd imagined, in some versions, unloading 29 years of hurt onto my parents in that room, making them feel it. But when the moment came, I didn't want that. It wouldn't have made me clean. It would have just made me loud. So I kept it simple. "I'm not here because my feelings were hurt," I said. "My feelings are my own problem. I'm here because what was done to me was illegal, and because it was done to other people who couldn't fight back. I could, so I did." I looked briefly at my parents. My grandmother taught me to keep the paper, because people lie and paper doesn't. I didn't fully understand what she meant until this year. I understand now. The hearing didn't end with a gavel or a gasp. It ended with Ms. Petrakis gathering her documents and saying she'd have a written determination within 10 days, and everyone filing out into a gray parking lot. But the real climax, the one that mattered to me, happened in that parking lot. Jason caught up to me by my car. He looked wrecked. "Liv," he said. I knew they were upset. I told them about your job. I didn't know they'd." He stopped. "I didn't know it would be like this. I swear I didn't." I looked at my little brother, the golden child, who had spent his whole life buying our parents' approval with other people's information, and I saw for the first time that he wasn't a villain. He was just someone who'd never once been asked to stand on his own, and who was realizing, right there in that parking lot, exactly what that had cost the people around him. "I know you didn't," I said. And then, because it was true, "But you have to decide who you're going to be now, Jason. They're going to need someone to blame, and it isn't going to be them. It never is. So decide before they decide for you." He was quiet a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, and something in his face shifted, the smallest crack in a lifetime of going along. "I'm sorry," he said, "for all of it, for always running to them." It wasn't everything, but it was the first true thing my brother had ever said to me, and I decided it was enough to start with. Behind him, I could see my parents by their car. My mother was talking rapidly, her hands moving, already building the version of events where she was the victim. My father just stood there, staring at the ground, saying nothing. For once in his life, he had nothing to hold on to. I got in my car and drove home. To my home, the one I still had. The determination came 8 days later, and it was thorough. Todd Keller was found to have executed a fraudulent eviction against me. The notice was voided entirely. My tenancy was affirmed. He was ordered to pay damages, and because of the pattern established by Denise, Devin, and the Hoffmans, the matter was referred to the county for further review. That referral turned into something much larger over the following months. There was an investigation into his property management practices across all 6 buildings. Fines that ran well into 5 figures. And eventually, the loss of his management contracts. The owners of those buildings did not want their names anywhere near a documented pattern of tenant fraud. Todd Keller, who had called everyone kiddo and fixed garbage disposals to make himself likable, was finished in the only business he knew. Denise Marsh, with Angela's help, filed her own claim and recovered damages. So did Devin. The Hoffmans got a formal apology and a settlement. I'd like to tell you I did that for purely noble reasons, but the honest truth is simpler. Once I saw what he'd done to them, I couldn't unsee it, and I couldn't have lived with myself if I'd taken my own win and walked away. My parents were not criminally charged. The county's focus was on Todd's business practices and a single third-party payment, while damning sat in a grayer legal space. But there is more than one kind of consequence, and the one that landed on Richard and Susan Brown was, I think, the one they feared most. Because it got out. Not through me. I never posted a word, never made a scene, never called a single relative to tell my side. I didn't have to. These things travel. My mother had spent decades curating an image among our large extended family. The devoted mother, the woman who'd sacrificed everything, whose independent-minded daughter was the ungrateful disappointment. And when the truth of what she and my father had actually done reached my aunts, my cousins, my grandmother's old circle, that image did not survive it. I heard about it in fragments. An aunt who called me, appalled, to say she'd had no idea and was so sorry. A cousin who quietly told me the family group chat had gone very cold toward my parents. My grandmother's best friend, 91 years old, who apparently said, and I treasure this, Millie always knew that girl had steel in her. Good, she'd be proud. Millie was my grandmother. It undid me a little hearing that. My parents lost the thing they'd spent their whole lives protecting, the story that they were good. They were not exiled with drama. They simply found that the calls slowed, the invitations thinned, the deference they'd always commanded quietly evaporated. Karmic and quiet and permanent, they never apologized. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect these stories to end with a tearful reconciliation on a doorstep, and mine didn't. My mother sent one email, weeks later, that was 3 paragraphs of grievance and ended with a single line about how she hoped I was happy with what I'd done to this family. I read it once. Then I filed it in my records folder because my grandmother taught me to keep the paper, and I closed my laptop and I let it go. The reconciliation I did get was smaller and realer, and it was with Jason. He kept his word. He started calling me, not with information for our parents, just to talk. He got a job, an actual one, and he kept it. When our father tried to enlist him in the campaign to cast me as the family destroyer, Jason didn't take the bait, and I know what that cost him because I know exactly how it feels to disappoint them on purpose for the first time. We're not suddenly best friends. There are 30 years of habit between us, and it will take a long time to build something true out of that. But he came to visit last month, and he sat at my kitchen table, and I made him tea in a regular mug and myself tea in the chipped blue cup, and we talked for 4 hours like 2 people slowly learning who each other actually are. I got a new job in the spring, a better one, honestly, at a company that values what I do. I stayed in my apartment, the one they tried to take from me. New management runs the building now, and the first time I paid rent to them and it cleared, I felt something I can only describe as vindication with the volume turned all the way down. Quiet. Complete. Sometimes I take the teacup down from the shelf and just hold it. It's chipped and it's ugly and it's worth nothing to anyone but me, and it is the single most valuable thing I own. My grandmother drank from it every morning of a life that tried to take everything from her and failed. She kept the paper. She kept her dignity. She kept herself. So did I. They thought losing my job would break me, and that losing my home would finish it. They thought $1,000 could buy my life back into a shape that suited them. They were wrong about the most important thing, and it's the thing I'll leave you with because I finally understand it in my bones. The people who love you build you up so you can stand on your own. The people who need you helpless will always, always tell you they're doing it for love. I know the difference now. And I made one call to a woman named Denise Marsh, a stranger who'd been wronged just like me, and that one call turned my private heartbreak into something that set 4 families free. Best thing I ever did.